The tissue paper made more noise than she did. That's the detail I keep coming back to. 30 guests in my backyard, lemonade sweating on a folding table, and the loudest sound in that whole moment was paper crumpling in her hands. My mother-in-law had chosen a pink gift bag, pastel ribbon, curled with scissors, the kind of touch she reserved for things she wanted photographed. She held it out to me in front of everyone, in front of my husband, in front of a cake shaped like tiny booties, and smiled the smile she saves for cameras. "He deserves better," she said, loud enough for the back row to hear. Inside the bag, under the tissue paper, were divorce papers. My hands didn't shake. I didn't gasp. I reached in, lifted the papers out, folded them once, and set them on my lap like something I'd already read. Because I'd been waiting for this exact bag for 11 months. Not that bag specifically. This shape of moment. I didn't know the ribbon would be pink or the guests would number 30, but I knew it was coming, and I knew exactly what I'd hand back when it did. She didn't know that yet. To understand why I wasn't surprised, you have to go back 3 years, to the week she moved into my house. Before I go back, let me tell you who I am and what this channel is about. We're not here for shouting matches. Not for slammed doors or thrown plates. Some of the most satisfying endings in life happen in complete silence. A folder handed over, a signature witnessed, a door closed calmly because it never needed slamming at all. If you've ever been underestimated by people who mistook your quiet for weakness, you're in the right place. This channel is for the ones who win without raising their voice because they never had to. If that's your kind of story, subscribe. There are more like this one. My name is Rachel Ainsley. For 11 years I've worked as a real estate attorney. I read fine print for a living. Deeds, easements, title reports, the clauses people skip because they trust whoever's handing them the pen. 11 years in, I'd learned that the difference between a disaster and a non-event usually comes down to 4 words buried in paragraph 6. People assume that makes you cold. It doesn't. It makes you someone who writes things down. The house came before my husband did. I bought it at 29 alone, with a down payment I'd saved dollar by dollar while my law school classmates leased convertibles. 3 bedrooms, a crooked oak tree, a mortgage in one name only, mine. When David and I married 2 years later, I didn't add his name to the deed, and he never asked me to. It wasn't a statement. That's just how title works. You don't rewrite a document that isn't broken. His mother, Carol, had opinions about that house before she ever set foot in it. The first time we visited her for dinner, she looked at the ring on my finger and said, "Well, at least he'll always have somewhere to land." I smiled. I filed it away. That's the thing about my job. You learn to notice a clause without reacting to it. You just note where it sits. There were other lines over the years. A comment about my efficient cooking. A joke retold at 2 family holidays about how I'd probably drawn up my own prenup in crayon. I never raised my voice at any of it. In my world, the person who reacts first is usually the person who loses leverage. Carol's world worked differently. Nothing in her life seemed to be written down. Promises were spoken and revised as needed. Debts got mentioned once, then quietly forgotten. She ran her relationships like a verbal lease, everyone agreeing to terms nobody could later produce. That difference didn't matter much until the year David's father passed, and the restaurant Carol had co-signed for went under with him. She called it a rough patch. She asked if she could stay with us, just temporarily, just until things settle. I remember exactly where I was standing when she said that word. In my own kitchen, holding a dish towel, 3 years of small comments already filed away in my head. I said yes. A woman with my job doesn't say yes to an undocumented arrangement by accident. I said yes because I already knew what temporarily, unsigned and unspoken, would eventually cost her. Temporarily turned into a season. The season turned into a year. The year turned into 3, and somewhere in there the word stopped meaning anything at all. Carol moved into the guest room with 2 suitcases and, within a month, an opinion about everything in the house. She rearranged my spice rack for efficiency. She told dinner guests cheerfully that I cooked like someone following a legal brief. Measured, joyless, precise. People laughed. I laughed too. Laughing costs nothing and reveals nothing, and by then, revealing nothing had become a kind of professional habit. In public, Carol performed devotion. At my firm's holiday party, she told my colleagues she was so lucky to have a daughter. Her hand resting on my arm for the photo, her voice warm enough to fill the room. In private, in my kitchen, she told me I was lucky David hadn't married up, that a man like him could have chosen someone softer, someone who didn't bring paperwork into everything. I noticed. I always notice. I keep a folder on my laptop, the kind I'd normally use for a case file, labeled nothing more dramatic than house, miscellaneous. Inside it, over 3 years I kept a running log. Not a diary. A record. The date Carol told a dinner table I'd trapped David into marriage with a smart mortgage. The month she stopped contributing to groceries after promising 6. The utility bill that jumped 40% the winter she moved in, a bill I paid in full every month, without being asked and without asking her to help. I logged it instead of confronting her, and I want to be honest about why. It wasn't fear. It was math. In my line of work, a person who reacts emotionally in the moment usually hands the other side something to work with. A raised voice, an ultimatum, a story that gets repeated at the next dinner party as evidence of how difficult I was. Carol was very good at that game. I'd watched her play it against David's father for 30 years. I wasn't going to hand her a single round of it. So I filed. Comments about my job. Comments about my appearance. The night she called my house the family home, in front of 6 guests, no correction issued, none needed, since the deed already existed, dated and notarized 4 years before she'd ever been given a key. I noted the date of that comment too. 3 years in, I found out I was pregnant. I told David first, in the kitchen, on a Tuesday, and for one whole evening it belonged only to us. That's one of the only nights from that entire house I remember without a note attached to it. We told Carol on a Sunday. I'd expected something resembling joy. What I got was Carol going very still for a moment, then saying brightly, "Well, that changes things, doesn't it?" Not a question. An assessment. Over the following weeks, I watched her recalculate. She started calling the nursery, the room she'd been sleeping in for 3 years, something that would need figuring out eventually. She mentioned, more than once, how grandmothers traditionally stayed close during a baby's first year, how cruel it would be, really, to make her leave now of all times. I didn't argue with any of it. I opened my laptop that night, found the folder labeled House, Miscellaneous, and started a new entry. Carol had just told me, without realizing it, exactly which room she intended to fight for. I already knew on paper it was never hers to fight for at all. The folder had a lot in it by then, but folders full of feelings don't hold up anywhere that matters. What matters is what's dated, signed, and provable. So that fall, sitting alone in my office after everyone had gone home, I stopped writing down what Carol had said and started pulling what actually existed. The deed was the easy part. I'd had it since I was 29, recorded, notarized, for years before Carol ever unpacked a suitcase in my guest room. One name on it. Mine. The second thing was smaller, but it mattered more than I expected. Buried in a group text from the week she moved in, sandwiched between a recipe and a photo of the dog, was a single line from Carol herself. "Just need somewhere temporary while we get back on our feet. Promise we'll pay you back for anything extra." I hadn't screenshotted it at the time. I hadn't needed to. Text messages, unlike memories, don't get kinder with age. It was still sitting there, untouched, 3 years later, in her own words, in her own punctuation. The third thing was an absence. I went looking for a lease, a rental agreement, anything with both our signatures on it, and found nothing. No document. No monthly rent record. No formal terms of any kind. Just a handshake and a word, repeated so often it had started to sound like a fact instead of a promise. Then there was the money. I pulled 3 years of utility statements and property tax records and laid them side by side. Every payment, every month, from my account. Not once had Carol contributed, not to taxes, not to utilities, not even during the 2 years she told people at dinner parties she was getting back on her feet. The math fit on one page. $41,000, give or take, covered quietly, alone, while she told our guests how lucky she was to have family looking after her. What was said, 3 years running, temporary? We'll pay you back. Just until things settle. What was documented? Nothing. No lease. No rent. No repayment. Just a deed with my name on it, a text with her promise on it, and a stack of bills with my signature on all of them. I sat with that contrast for a long time that night because I understood something Carol didn't. In my field, an occupant with no lease and no formal agreement isn't protected by sentiment. She's protected, if at all, by a handshake, and handshakes expire the moment the person who extended one decides it's time. Temporary, left undocumented long enough, isn't a status. It's a clock. I was the only one in that house who'd bothered to check what time it was. I didn't act that night. I'm not impulsive, and this wasn't a decision to make alone in an office at 10 p.m. The following week I called Priya, a colleague 2 doors down from mine, someone who'd handled more informal occupant disputes than anyone else at our firm, and someone who'd watched me absorb 3 years of comments about my own house without saying a word. I told her everything. The deed. The text. The $41,000. The nursery Carol had started calling hers. Priya listened, then asked one question. Do you have a date in mind? I did, as it happened. My baby shower was 5 weeks away. Carol had already asked, twice, whether she could say a few words during the gift opening. I told Priya I wanted the paperwork ready before then. I just didn't know yet that I'd be handing it over in front of 30 guests. Priya drafted the notice in 9 days. She's efficient that way, the kind of colleague who treats a favor for a friend with the same rigor she'd give a paying client, maybe more. She sent it over with a subject line that just said, "Ready when you are," and underneath it, a longer message that had nothing to do with the paperwork at all. I need you to hear this from someone who isn't you, she wrote. You have covered $41,000 for a woman who tells strangers you trapped her son. You're allowed to be angry about that. You don't have to perform calm for me. I read it twice. I didn't disagree with a word of it. I just didn't know what to do with the anger she was describing. By then I'd spent so long filing things away instead of feeling them that I wasn't entirely sure where I'd put it. Priya said out loud what I suspect a lot of people around me were quietly thinking. She'd watched Carol call my house the family home at a dinner party and watched me smile instead of correcting her. She'd watched 3 years of comments roll off me in real time and never once bought the performance. You're not calm, she told me once over coffee. You're just very good at waiting. She wasn't wrong. The notice was ready, printed, signed, dated, sitting in a folder, waiting for a moment that made sense. I wasn't going to hand it to Carol over breakfast. I wasn't going to mail it and let her open it alone, where no one would ever know what she'd tried to do first. If she wanted a stage, I intended to use the one she built. That decision got easier 3 weeks later, when David's sister, Meg, called me on a Thursday night, her voice low, like she was standing in a hallway instead of a room. I wasn't trying to overhear, she said, but Mom was on the phone with Aunt Diane, and she said the shower would be the perfect time to give you a real gift. She said something about papers. She sounded pleased with herself. I thanked Meg. I didn't ask her to say more. I already knew, with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from guessing, exactly what kind of gift Carol meant to give me in front of 30 people. I just needed to make sure mine was wrapped first. The morning of the shower, Carol was, by every visible measure, wonderful. She arrived 2 hours early with a car full of favors. Little jars of honey with hand-tied ribbons, place cards written in calligraphy she must have practiced for weeks. She hung paper lanterns from the oak tree in my own backyard and told anyone who'd listen how she'd always dreamed of a day like this. She hugged me at the door, in front of the caterer, and said, "I'm just so happy for this family," loud enough that 3 guests turned to smile at us. By then I'd learned to treat generosity like this the way I'd treat a contract offered without explanation. Something that looks this good, this suddenly, usually has a clause coming. The shower went the way showers go. Finger sandwiches. A game with baby photos guests had to match to their parents. My folder, the real one, sat exactly where I'd left it, tucked into a tote bag under the gift table, close enough to reach without anyone noticing I'd placed it there on purpose. Then came the gifts. Carol had positioned herself to go last. She waded through onesies and diaper bags and a second-hand rocking chair from Meg, and when her turn came, she stood instead of staying seated the way everyone else had. She lifted a pink gift bag with curled ribbon, held it toward me with both hands, and let the yard go quiet before she said anything at all. "I've thought a lot about what a mother should give," she said to me, but really to the 30 people behind me. "And I've decided the kindest thing I can give my son is honesty." She smiled for whoever was holding a phone up. "He deserves better," she said. I opened the bag. Tissue paper, and under it, a manila envelope, and inside that, divorce papers, already partially filled out in her handwriting where mine should have been. Some of the yard gasped. I didn't. I unfolded the papers once, looked at them exactly as long as I would have looked at any document handed to me at work, and set them down in my lap. "Thank you," I said. Just that. No edge in it, none needed. Then I reached under the gift table, into the tote bag I'd placed there myself that morning, and pulled out an envelope of my own. I hadn't planned to speak before handing it over. I didn't need to. I stood, the way she had, and held it out to her with both hands, the same way she'd held out hers to me. "I've thought a lot about what's fair, too," I said. Carol took it, still smiling, still performing for whoever was watching, and slid a finger under the flap. I watched her read the first line. I watched the smile hold for exactly as long as muscle memory could sustain it on its own, then disappear entirely, replaced by something closer to the actual color of her face. She looked up at me, then back down at the page, like a second read might say something different from the first. It didn't. I want to pause here for a second because I know how this looks from the outside. 30 guests. A pale face. An envelope that clearly said something Carol didn't expect. If you'd been standing in that backyard, I imagine a lot of you would have raised your voice by now. Some of you might have grabbed the paper back. Some of you might have said something you'd have regretted by dessert. Tell me in the comments. If you were holding that envelope, watching her read it, what would you have done? Would you have let the silence sit, the way I did, or said something out loud, right there, in front of everyone? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Carol was still holding the papers, still reading, and the yard was still waiting to hear what I'd say next. "Eviction notice," Carol said out loud, before she seemed to realize she was reading it to the whole yard instead of just herself. Someone near the dessert table murmured, "Wait, isn't that the house she's been living in?" 3 years, someone else added, quieter, like they weren't sure they were allowed to say it. Carol didn't answer either of them. She kept looking at the page, as if a second reading might rearrange the words into something kinder. "This is a joke," she said finally, looking up at me. Her voice had the shape of her old confidence, but none of the weight behind it. "You can't be serious." "I'm not being unkind," I said. "I'm being accurate. That's a formal notice addressed to you for the house at Birch Lane. The one you've been staying in for 3 years. "Staying in," she repeated. "This is my home." "It's my house," I said evenly. "It has been since I was 29. The deed has one name on it. Mine. It always has." I watched her look toward David, the way people do when they want someone else to argue their case for them. He didn't say anything. He was looking at the papers too, and something in his expression had already started to shift, the stillness of a person realizing he'd never once asked a question he probably should have. "He deserves better," Carol said again, quieter this time, like the line had worked so well the first time she thought it might work twice. It didn't land the same. A phrase repeated without conviction just sounds like something memorized. "You're right," I said. "He does." She straightened slightly, as if she thought I was agreeing with her. "This isn't personal," I continued. "You were never asked to pay rent, and I never asked you to sign anything, so legally nothing was ever established between us. No lease, no tenancy, nothing. You stayed because I let you stay. That's not the same as a right to stay. This notice isn't punishing you. It's the paperwork finally matching what was already true." "That can't be legal," Carol said, and for the first time all afternoon her voice actually cracked, not with grief, but with the panic of someone realizing the ground under an argument has quietly disappeared. "You can't just throw out family. There has to be something, some agreement, something in writing." "There is something in writing," I said. I reached into the tote bag one more time. "You wrote it yourself." I laid 3 things on the gift table, one at a time, the way you'd lay out evidence for someone who still thought this was a conversation instead of a record. The first was the deed. Recorded, notarized, dated 4 years before David and I ever stood in front of a courthouse and signed anything together. One name on it. Mine. I turned it so Carol could read the date herself. People believe a document faster when their own eyes do the reading instead of mine. "That's from before we were even married," I said. "Before David and I existed as a couple anywhere on paper. This house was never part of what we built together. It was already built by me alone." The second was a blank lease template, printed that morning and signed, both name fields empty. "This is what should exist if you'd ever actually been a tenant here," I said. "No signatures. No dates. No terms. Because none were ever agreed to. 3 years, and neither of us ever wrote down what temporary meant." The third was her own text message, printed and highlighted in one place. "Just need somewhere temporary while we get back on our feet. Promise we'll pay you back for anything extra." "You wrote this the week you moved in," I said. "Your word. Your promise. Never followed by a lease, a rent check, a single dollar toward taxes or utilities in 3 years. I have those records too if you'd like to see them. $41,000, roughly. I covered all of it." Quietly. Carol didn't answer. She stared at the printed text message like she was trying to remember typing it, or hoping she hadn't. I looked past her to David, because this was the moment I'd known would land differently for him than for anyone else in that yard. He wasn't looking at his mother anymore. He was looking at the utility bills I'd set down last, the ones with his own address on them, 3 years of payments, his name nowhere on a single one. "Did you know," he asked quietly, to no one in particular, "that she'd never paid anything? Any of it?" Nobody answered him. He didn't really need anyone to. I turned back to Carol. "You said, at the gift table, that a mother should give honesty," I said. "So here's mine. You lived in a house that was never yours, under a word you never honored, and you spent 3 years telling people at dinner parties that I was lucky to have family looking after me, while I paid every bill attached to the roof over your head." Carol opened her mouth. Whatever she meant to say didn't arrive in time. "He deserves better," I said before she could. "You're right. He does." I let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. That's why I finally gave him a wife who doesn't pay for the people who try to replace her. The yard went completely silent. Not the polite silence of a party between songs. The specific, airless silence of 30 people realizing they'd just watched something end. Carol looked down at the deed one more time, then at the lease with no names on it, then at her own handwriting staring back at her from a printed page. Whatever script she'd rehearsed for that gift bag had no next line written for this moment. She set the envelope down on the table, picked up her purse instead, and walked toward the house without another word, past the paper lanterns she'd hung herself that morning, past the guests who'd been smiling for her an hour earlier. Nobody stopped her. Carol stayed with her sister for 2 weeks after the shower. I heard about it secondhand from Meg, who told me Carol had spent most of that time insisting the whole thing had been a misunderstanding, though she never specified which part. Not the deed. Not the text message. Not the $41,000. Just, in general, a misunderstanding, the way people describe a consequence they didn't expect to actually arrive. David didn't defend her. That was new. For 3 years he'd occupied a kind of neutral ground between us, the son who didn't want to referee his wife and his mother, and I'd let him stay there because forcing the issue never seemed worth what it would cost. But something had shifted for him at that gift table, watching his own name missing from 3 years of bills he'd assumed, without ever checking, were being split evenly. I should have asked. He told me more than once in the weeks after. I never once asked. I didn't need the apology exactly. But I noticed it, and this time I filed it somewhere better than the folder. 5 weeks later I called Carol myself. Not out of forgiveness, and I'll be honest that this genre likes a tidy redemption, and I'm not going to pretend I felt one. I called because unresolved things, left undocumented, have a way of costing someone eventually, and I'd already decided I wasn't interested in being the one it cost. I offered her a lease. A real one this time, both name fields filled in, market rate, first and last month specified, a fixed move-out date 11 months out, enough time to find somewhere of her own without pretending the arrangement was open-ended again. I didn't offer to forget the eviction notice. I offered to formalize what should have existed 3 years earlier, on terms that were fair rather than generous, because fairness was the only currency I trusted either of us to actually honor. Carol was quiet on the phone for a while. "You're not going to let me just apologize," she said finally. "It wasn't quite a question." "I'm letting you sign something," I said. "That's always mattered more to me than what people say." She signed it the following week. She's paid on time every month since. I checked because that's simply who I am, and because a document only means something if someone's actually watching whether it's followed. Our daughter was born 7 weeks after that phone call, on a Tuesday morning, weighing 6 pounds 9 ounces. Carol came to the hospital. She brought a gift, wrapped plainly this time, no ribbon curled for anyone's camera. Inside was a set of pajamas and nothing else. No envelope, no second document, no line rehearsed for an audience. David held our daughter for the first time in a hallway outside the delivery room, and I watched him look at his mother differently than I ever had before. Not with suspicion exactly. With the attentiveness of a man who'd finally learned to check the paperwork himself. Our daughter turned 1 last month. We had a small party in the same backyard, the same oak tree, no paper lanterns this time, no gift bags with curled ribbon waiting to be photographed. Carol came. She sat near the back, helped clear plates without being asked, and left before dessert without making an announcement out of it. She still pays rent on the 1st of every month, on time, every time, into an account I check the way I check anything I've agreed to trust. We don't talk much beyond logistics. I'm not going to tell you that's a sad ending. For us it's simply an honest one, built on what's actually documented rather than what someone hoped might eventually be forgiven. David checks things now. Bills, arrangements, the fine print he used to leave entirely to me. I notice it every time. I think about that gift bag sometimes. The pink ribbon, the smile for whoever was holding a phone up, the line she'd clearly rehearsed. She thought she was handing me an ending. She didn't know I'd been holding the actual ending, folded and ready, for weeks. That's the thing about people who perform generosity in public and cruelty in private. Sooner or later, someone stops reacting to the performance and starts reading the paperwork instead. That's what this channel is for. The ones who win quietly because they were never actually the one out of control to begin with. If this story sounded familiar, if you've ever had your own gift bag moment, your own quiet folder, your own temporary that went on far too long, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one.